So how does cortisol relate to sickness? I'll see you inside. So I think even saying the word cortisol puts a lot of people in a bad mood, but I think it's much more complex than people actually realize. So yes, cortisol is actually increased during psychological or physical stress, but it isn't actually responsible for the stress itself. Nor is the production of cortisol always a bad thing. You see, cortisol can actually rise acutely in response to a perceived reward. So when we see something as exciting or enjoyable, such as a sports competition, we will increase our cortisol levels. Cortisol actually appears to help us cope with the stress. For example, there are studies that found that cortisol treated patients actually reported significantly less negative feelings and mood after they were exposed to stress, meaning that the cortisol actually helped them better cope with a psychological stressor. So even though there was an external stress, internally they actually didn't get as stressed. The studies actually kind of seem to indicate that elevated cortisol during a stressful situation actually reduces our negative emotions that we respond with. And now cortisol is also very important for simply keeping us moving and energetic throughout the day. In a healthy person, cortisol levels should be the highest in the morning, and this will actually increase our blood glucose and give us this energetic boost that prepares us to face the demands of the day. And now, as cortisol increases, it increases certain metabolic processes. However, one very important side effect of cortisol is that it will actually inhibit us from producing certain inflammatory mediators. And these are simply molecules inside of our body that will actually cause internal inflammation. And now, yes, inflammation could be caused by a physical trauma like a cut, but most of the inflammation actually occurs as a response to an internal pathogen. And it will actually increase the body's ability to divert immune cells to the location of a pathogen, and it signals the presence and location of the pathogen itself. And then cortisol will actually inhibit the first step of the inflammatory response, thus inhibiting the activation of the immune system. And now acutely, this can actually be very beneficial, as cortisol often increases when there is a psychological stressor, which evolutionarily would likely have been a threat to our survival. But in the 21st century, most of the things that increase our cortisol are simply just a threat to our social status. Things like negative comments on social media, or negative emails, or simply just an abundance of work, all will increase our levels of cortisol. And unfortunately, so will things like physical exercise. They will acutely increase cortisol. And the only time that I really wouldn't recommend someone do exercise is if they are already in a state of extremely high levels of cortisol. Simply the addition of specifically high intensity exercise will elevate this cortisol even more and reduce their immune system even greater. And the problem with this is that just because we don't have an immune response doesn't mean the pathogen is no longer there. Therefore, hypothetically, if you were to immediately remove all of this cortisol, your immune system would begin to spot all of the pathogens that it had been neglecting. And if this cortisol elevation had been blunting this inflammatory response for a very long period of time, you may have actually, for lack of a better word, accumulated some internal pathogens that your body has to begin to fight off. And this may actually explain the phenomenon of working extremely hard on something for a period of time, which is usually a high stress and high cortisol period. And then when you decide to take a vacation, that is when you get tired and oftentimes get sick. Quite simply, the production of cortisol actually kept your brain and your mind focused on the task at hand, but neglected all the bodily functions that need to occur to reduce pathogenic bacteria and other things of the like. Simply, the cortisol allowed your mind to stay focused at the task at hand, and some of these internal stressors actually kind of just built up in the background. And then once you remove the psychological or physical stressor, your cortisol levels will decrease, and your body will realize that these things have been building up the whole time. And even if you have never experienced something like this, I think it's important to understand and simply just provides evidence as to why we may want to simply just take a step back every once in a while. However, as you know, the way that we actually adapt is through stress. but this is typically in the form of an acute stress and then a recovery period. However, chronic stress doesn't allow for the recovery to occur, and it may actually be silencing other metabolic processes that need to be rectified. So the first thing you may actually have to do is not add in these acute stressors, but first remove the chronic stress. And once you finally removed the chronic stressors, then you can add in the acute beneficial stressors. These are simply referred to as hormetic stressors, or stress that we can actually recover from and grow from. And the best example simply is just exercise. However, if you're managing 2 jobs and trying to start a business and trying to parent a bunch of kids, maybe adding in more exercise will simply just be adding to the cortisol that you already have. And this puts you past the threshold in which cortisol can be hormetic and puts you into a territory where it may be blunting your immune system and causing damage. And I absolutely cannot give you any advice as to how this would apply to your life because everyone's in a different situation. And it's important to determine all the psychological stressors that you face on a day-to-day basis and try and remove any of the ones that are completely unnecessary to your life. And if you're in a situation in which you feel you can handle more stress, then you can add in these hormetic stressors that will actually enhance your life in the long run. So I hope today's podcast was interesting and maybe kind of provided some insight as to why we actually seem to get sick in the lowest periods of stress. And maybe it persuades you to just take a step back every once in a while and ask yourself if you've had enough time to actually recover from the stressors in your life, or if you've been chronically exposed to stress for a prolonged period of time. And since I am recording this in school, now I have to go to French. So thank you for listening, and I hope you come back for next episode. Have a great